All right, welcome back to another episode of Friday After Class right here on the Pixelated Pedagogy YouTube channel. We're a production of Northeast Iowa Community College. So today we're reflecting on an article actually posted in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And this article is titled, "Is This the End of Reading?" So students are coming to college less able and less willing to read. So we're going to reflect on that a little bit today. And if you are curious yourself about viewing the article, you can find a link to that in the description below. The article is free to browse, but it does require you to create an account. But definitely check that out. So without further ado, let's dive in and start with some main takeaways. So Shannon, let's start with you. You brought the article forward, and really we're excited to share this with us.
Yeah, when I saw the article, I was interested in it right away because we've been having a lot of conversations both here, on our team and also outside of work. I've been having conversations about reading assignments and students in general. As an instructor, I think I've seen this definitely be the case that students are not likely to complete reading assignments most of the time. I have an 8th grade student who doesn't have textbooks anymore at all and doesn't get homework. And so that's been something that's been at the top of my mind because we have sometimes we have high school students in our classes. And if they're not in high school, many of them have recently graduated. And so if that's a trend in K-12 education, that they're not being assigned reading anymore, or not to the extent that we were when we were in school, then as college instructors, we need to think about that, right? We can't expect students to be able to go from not reading homework assignments at all to reading chapters and being able to synthesize that and learn from it on their own when they get to us. So that was what I was kind of thinking about as I was reading the article and why I kind of wanted to bring it up.
And I would add that this is a thing that sort of, the word conspiracy is used in the article in an interesting way. And it's always almost felt like a conspiracy to me, like 10, 15 years ago when I first became a community college instructor, the ways in which no one really wanted to talk about the nature of this problem, and also the ways in which we couldn't imagine a solution to it, right? The solution among history faculty 12 years ago in online classes or hybrid classes was to just do the multiple choice questions, don't ask them to write, was kind of the thinking. And I was so blown away because it was so important for me as a writer. I'd worked in a writing center. It improved my writing a lot, like writing and getting others feedback and then helping them with the writing seemed to be such an important part of the academic experience for me and for everyone. It was very surprising to walk in and find everyone had sort of resigned themselves to this reality. And that was 12 years ago. The article talks about the ways in which COVID's change, cultures change. You're talking about, your son not having those books. I've got a 6-year-old who's learning to read words, learning phonics through a tablet, which is interesting, which I did not expect. She's my first one in school. So the world is definitely changing, and there's a lot of ways in which community college instructors, probably university professors too, don't know what that world's like. Sort of assume it was their world, but it's not. So yeah, this a great article, lengthy, kind of entertains lots of different perspectives on kind of what happened and what we can do as a result. If we need to do anything, it kind of just asks a lot of questions, which is great.
Yeah, so let's look at those, root causes and factors here. So obviously the rise of the internet, smartphones in everyone's hands, social media. How do you think that has played a role here with reading habits and attention spans?
I mean, we hear all the time about how people don't have attention spans anymore, right? And we can probably all see it in our own habits as well. We're always scrolling TikTok or, reading the first few lines of an article and then assuming we know everything about it, right? We do it all the time. But I would argue that maybe lengthy reading assignments were never the best approach. I think that it used to be the case that it was basically the only way for students and faculty to get that information across was to go to a textbook, right? You used to have to go to an encyclopedia to look up information about a thing that happened. But now we have all of these other opportunities, all these other avenues to take in information and to learn about things. And so why should we continue to focus on that one sort of old method that only engages one sense, basically, in one kind of learning preference when we've got so many opportunities now that we can take advantage of?
And there was a moment, I think, especially when I started teaching, when the iPhone was sort of proliferating and when smartphone adoption was really accelerating. There was a spirit of like, let's beat the phone. Like, we can beat this. Like, this is a temporary thing. We'll figure out a way. I'll collect, the community college I worked for, they were faculty collecting the smartphones of adults, like at the entrance to the classroom, right? So there was this sort of naive belief that we could overcome and we could just kind of hold through. But now you see high schools, and some high schools are actually sort of moving back a little bit but when high schools kind of allowed the phone, the culture had changed. And that's one thing I would emphasize in relation to this. It almost doesn't matter that the world has changed or where it came from or if it's a good thing or a bad thing. The world has changed as a result of these innovations, in the same way that American newspaper reading habits changed with the advent of cable news, right? The ways in which what we get access to is really, really different. AI will only further cement these sort of augmented and idiosyncratic ways that we access the information we want at a moment's notice, whether written or YouTube or whatever it is. So we're in a disconnected world as a result. And so we have to do the best with the world that we have. Like, that's leading the change. It's not that students are broken, it's that the culture changed. And I think we've got to figure out a way to respond.
I don't know if it's a disconnected world or if it's a more connected world than it was.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to think about.
How about isolation? Isolation was a theme that came up in that reading, and talking about people self-selecting out of communities or finding online communities. But, it's that whole bowling alone concept of what's happened in our culture too. People are choosing online classes, even though it might not be best for them, because they value other things than that kind of community, the academic community as we've imagined it.
Yeah, that's interesting, because what is more isolating than sitting in a room and reading 80 pages of a textbook by yourself? Right? I mean, yes, some of our practices today are isolating, but being assigned chapters and chapters of reading to do as homework is not exactly a collaborative effort.
Yeah, the article talks about how textbooks are boring. I don't know. I don't think textbooks are boring, but okay, I'll see that point.
Well, I think a nice segue there is, looking at learning styles and how they play a role in this. I know when I did my graduate work and my undergraduate work, looking back at that and reflecting on it, I don't really remember anything that was covered in any of the textbooks. The things I remember most are when there were videos in the online platform of my instructor not lecturing from his home, but literally going out across the country and having different backgrounds and relating that to what he was talking about that particular day. And then, of course, always remember in those science courses doing those different experiments and hands-on activities in the classroom itself. Those things stick out. Group work, especially, building those relationships with other students were definitely a big impact as well. What are both of your thoughts kind of related to learning styles?
Yeah, that was one thing I thought about a lot when I was reading this article. And I went actually to the VARC website, which has a questionnaire on it that I think they've had over 1 million people take to determine what learning preferences look like for each individual, out of the 4 main ones, which are visual, auditory, reading, writing, and kinesthetic. And overwhelmingly, if you look at the research on their site, I think it's like 66% of people have a multitude of learning preferences, and reading, writing is the lowest if you look at the group by far. And so that was really interesting to me. I was thinking about, well, again, maybe reading has never been the best way to reach students, if this is the case, right? And now more than ever, there are ways to learn that involve all of those learning preferences. And so we don't have to fall back on the reading, writing as the one to use, right?
I still think reading should be an option in that mix. Like, I still think it's valuable. You're having this sort of one-on-one. You say it's lonely, but I kind of think of reading as very different. I think of it as really intimate. If it's well written, right? If the author has a perspective or a personality, and I'm in the humanities, so I'm reading more of that than a business manual or something like that. But if I'm interested, if it's the right material, most people would find that additive with the video, with something else, with new methods of assessment. I still think reading's got to be in the mix.
I think it should be in the mix. I mean, I'm an English teacher, right? I like to read. I like reading, but even I will, depending on the type of information I want to take in. If I want to listen to a story, if I want a story, I read a book. If I want to learn about something that happened in history, or I want to listen to pretty much any nonfiction, I listen to it. And because audiobooks are so easily and readily available now, I can do that. I probably wouldn't pick up those books and read them otherwise. And so for me, having that option is really important.
Both of us have bookshelves behind us, though. Like, we're communicating a message here about what's valuable and what's important. And couldn't you reach for one of those books behind you and just like, this is a singular perspective. I need to read this. There's no other way but, or like, I guess you could listen to like someone's lectures or something like that. But it's hard for me to imagine this, like what a book can deliver in terms of, this book's 300 years old, in terms of like a singular perspective on the world and a way of thinking and a completeness, right? A book contains complete ideas, complete theories.
It sounds like your bookshelf is full of nonfiction. Mine is almost entirely fiction.
Yeah.
So that might be a big difference there, right?
Yeah.
And from a completely different aspect, I do not have a book anywhere in my near vicinity right now. So that is definitely a different avenue there too.
Yeah, learning styles. Yeah, we got to meet students. Like if the students have changed, and maybe they really haven't, to Shannon's point, but they're different than what we think they are to some extent. So we have to change what we're delivering, what we're offering, and how we're assessing, which I'm sure we'll talk about as well. We definitely have to, education definitely has to change to meet the needs of these students. If reading ain't doing it, we've got to broaden what we do, what we offer, for sure.
Yeah, I think the world has changed in that we can now provide all these other opportunities to students who couldn't learn best from reading in the first place. And not that our students have changed so much as the type of student that is in our college courses has changed, right? Like students have become more diverse in terms of ability and disability and age and income and, and pretty much everything. And so that all has to be factored into the way that we approach learning.
Right. That might be a good transition for kind of our next set of questions about like improving reading comprehension. So how could we make our instructional materials and our practices, what we do, more engaging, more relevant to students' interests, while preserving some element of reading? What can we do to kind of fix this nature of like comprehension and also the writing that comes after the reading that the article says folks are also struggling with? How do we help students retain information better, communicate better, if not through reading?
I mean, I think we do it by providing choice, by giving students, sure, maybe you do have a link to a reading, but also a video the student can watch or something they can go out and do to help them learn and practice the material, right? And then let them choose what works best for them.
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same thing. Having a diverse range of activities to partake in, and maybe in the way that you set up your course, you can kind of have students choose their own adventure to learn the same thing, but in whatever way works best for them. Maybe that's something interactive and hands-on. Maybe that's through a really nice technical tool. Or, some students, they still love, pen and paper and having an actual hard copy of a book in front of them. So all those are valid, and it's good to have, that choices and all those options available if you can.
It's never been easier to offer all of that. Like at our institution, you can adopt a course pack through our textbook publisher, which is like $20, which means people can get a printed copy. They don't have to try to print 400 pages at the library. We can record lectures and put them online. You can easily sort of link to, or you're encouraged to adopt OER, which are easy to make available at very low cost to students. There's ways to give them more stuff. And you can then start to use all these ed tech websites and videos and YouTube and TED Talks and just research from the library, right? Like you can link them directly to actual discipline-specific research too. You can make them researchers even at the community college level. We can be connected. One challenge with all of this, though, I think sometimes people like the textbook or stick with it, instructors do, because it's fairly simple. They know the textbook. They don't have to do anything with it. Sometimes there's publisher content, but everything else requires even like third-party publisher stuff, right? Like I need to access, I need this system to work. Is there a danger is that part of the reason why instructors are staying with reading, I wonder, is because it feels safer and less risky, like there's going to be a bunch of tech support issues or something like that? Is that why we're insisting reading is the way? Because we think it will be simpler for all?
I had a conversation with a faculty member just last week. We were talking about assigning textbooks or getting away from that mentality. And he teaches in the sciences. And his argument was, there's just too much information for me to go out and find in a bunch of different places for the course. So I need the textbook because it is a place that houses everything I need the students to know, which is understandable in a course like that. Like think about biology, right? You need it to be, you need a certain amount of information, and you need it to be organized in the right way so that students can kind of scaffold what they learn. But I wonder if maybe a best practice is for the instructor, for that textbook to be a guide for the instructor more than an assignment for the student, right? Like maybe the instructor can use it and then maybe find other activities or record lectures and make their own slide decks and things like that to actually present the information.
Well, and AI would enable a lot of that much more quickly than it used to, and it could still be personalized to that specific instructional, modality or those course objectives at that specific school. Like, it's never been easier to kind of create your own stuff again. The other question that's sort of related on this topic, and it gets to the same one, was like, is the technology a distraction from the reading? I think we're saying that it can be additive if we incorporate it or harness it or use it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for some learners, the technology is the thing that makes it so that they can learn. And so we can't count that, we can't discount that.
Right. Devil's advocate, real quick. Is there, if we, like the first instructor is in the article was worried about like just pulling all the reading out. Like, do we do students a disservice if we move totally reading free, whether at the high school level or the community college level? If they get videos, are they losing something, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think I would advocate for getting rid of reading entirely. Like I said before, I think giving choice is useful. And I think teaching students to read smaller amounts at a time and digest that is probably more effective than trying to give them chapters of a textbook to read, right? Like teaching them digital literacy skills, I think will go farther than teaching them how to read a textbook, especially if you're thinking about applicability to their lives.
Sure.
Exactly. Yeah, because after schooling and even when you're in school, there's always going to be things that you need to read, whether it's like a medical statement or setting up your retirement fund. Like, you have to read through that stuff and understand it. And, a lot of those places have, in thinking about retirement in particular, they have great websites that have interactive tools that help you kind of walk through things. There's videos and things like that. But there's a lot of information there that you have to digest. So having that skill set that comes from reading and understanding what you have read is definitely crucial and shouldn't just go by the wayside.
And that's a perfect example of where we can put real world application in, right? Where you can teach students how to understand health insurance plans or how to read through, how to understand a policy or write a policy versus writing a 12-page essay. Right? Like, unless they're going to go into the world of academia, they probably aren't going to need to do a whole lot of academic writing. And so the basics, sure, are important, but maybe we can do more in terms of critical thinking and reading and writing in more of a real world setting.
I don't think we have a question sort of about assessment, but I definitely want to come back to that, maybe that idea, or if they're not writing so much, what does that look like in other traditional disciplines? Let's move over to this broader context, though. We talked a little bit about what's changed about our students, but the bigger question is, how do broader cultural and societal trends contribute to the issue? What else is going on? The one thing I wanted to talk about was video games. Like, I wrote that word down. I don't think it comes up in the article, but our students are, like, the cell phone obviously gamified a lot. Even your steps are tracked and counted, and that can be a game, and the ways in which people use Snapchat are gamified, right? So we've missed an opportunity, I would think, if we haven't harnessed that power of what games can do in terms of how we're assessing learning. And if they're getting games everywhere else, or even it's not a game, but like using an app is sort of intuitive and kind of fun, right? Like, it's an experience. It's a little bit different. And if everything is presented like that here, then I think reading does feel real strange or real weird. And if we could gamify reading and incentivize students to read a little bit differently, I think we'd have better results in terms of getting students to do the reading if we properly incentivize them to do so, giving them a couple of nudges or reasons and an experience that's kind of fun too.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is basically turning reading into a kinesthetic activity to meet that learning preference, right? If it's a thing that you immerse yourself in, and once you do a little bit, you get a reward, and it becomes this more immersive activity, then it's definitely going to speak to those learners in a more effective way.
Well, in the article, what does the article say about students not doing the reading? Like, the article talked about students, and this is, again, that broader societal context. Like, the article sort of alleges that students are more interested in kind of checking a box, more concerned about grades than they are like demonstrated learning or sort of classical learning. Is anything else sort of going on in terms of the broader cultural and social trends that we should be reacting to or changing?
Well, I don't think students are not doing the reading because they don't care. I think I think they're procrastinating it because it's a big, intimidating task that they don't feel prepared for. I mean, it happened to me when I was a college student. If I was assigned textbook readings in a class that I wasn't super interested in, 9 times out of 10, I didn't do it, or I sat down and technically did it, but I didn't actually actively read and I didn't retain anything from what I sat down and read. Right. So I see where they're coming from, definitely. And I don't know for sure when we see statistics about students who don't do the reading, I don't know if it's the case that they're not getting the information at all, or if they're finding that information elsewhere. Maybe they're going out and watching some YouTube videos or going to Khan Academy or something like that. I don't know. Maybe they're not, but I know what procrastination does to your brain, and your brain interprets it as something that's going to physically hurt. And so if a task like that feels really daunting, they're going to avoid it because their brain is sort of having that response. So it makes a lot of sense to me.
So as the method of assessment, is that the failure? Like, we've set a set of conditions where they're expected to do a thing. Presumably they demonstrate it in a way. And if the assessment or the learning itself is sort of not relevant, like you described, like if we fail to connect the student to the relevance of the discipline or the course, is that like that's a fundamental failure that happens before the reading is assigned, I would say. Like if you were given the assignment, the scenario you outlined, Shannon, where it just wasn't interesting to you. I can't remember your exact quote. If it had been interesting to you, would that have been a different experience? I would assume yes.
Yeah. Yes, it would have. Yeah. And I sort of think that maybe college students choose majors almost based on their learning preferences. If you think about it, not unknowingly, but I was an English major. Most of my classes were small and were really immersive, and we workshopped and, we wrote things as a class, and there was very little lecturing, and those classes were much easier for me to learn in than courses where there were 200 people sitting in a lecture hall. Right. So yeah, that would be interesting to explore more too. But if it goes back to reading assignments, we're assigning reading assignments across the board, regardless of students' preferences and majors and things like that, then it makes sense that it's not going to work in many cases.
Sure. Next question, addressing the broader context. What can educators and parents do to promote critical thinking? Presumably this is, if they're not reading, what else can they be? Can we teach them how to do? To think critically, or to be good readers? Or
I would argue that you can teach critical thinking based on any number of resources. So a YouTube video, for example, you could have students analyze and determine if it was doing a good job of, first of all, when we analyze writing, we look at audience and purpose and tone, right? You can do that in a YouTube video or in a speech or even a movie. And so you can analyze those things, and you can make a claim as to whether that piece of content is effective for its audience or not, regardless of whether you're reading it or watching it. So I would argue that critical thinking, reading and writing they're both instances of critical thinking, and that can be taught and demonstrated any number of ways. So students can write an essay to demonstrate that they've analyzed something, or they can have a presentation about it and they can get the same effect, right?
Right. I think of, and I don't know, there might be like rhetoric and speech teachers out there who would disagree with me, and they might be right. But in my mind, speaking aloud and writing your thoughts down are the same thing, or the end product can be the same. You can communicate effectively. You can wrestle with those ideas. The same thing can be achieved. So yeah, you're right. Like I've got students submitting videos, and I know you do too, Shannon, where they're doing all these things. And we've changed the way we're assessing with rubrics because of what AI has done to writing output. And we're asking students to kind of write a little bit differently. And I'm getting a better experience overall. I'm doing this thing that students don't expect me to do. I'm saying, write like you actually talk. Like, stop pretending to write in this academic way that others have coached you to do, and just be authentic and like communicate yourself as clearly as you possibly can, given where you're at and the words that you use. And I'll work with you authentically, right? And then we'll kind of build up from there. So yeah, so this does sort of unlock like new methods of assessment, new rubrics, new ways of demonstrating understanding that might not require the same kind of communication we've been talking about. I worry about the lack of research, because so much gets published online. The first thing something is available is often, unless they're doing like a live release, book release party that you're listening to or whatever, or a Q&A session, it's a paper, right? So I know that our students aren't going and doing like scientific research all the time, but we want to get them ready for that. And it's a hard thing to read a quantitative research paper. So I'm asking the same question again, but any danger in that at all? I guess that's the other question. What are the potential long-term consequences of declining reading comprehension for individuals and society as a whole, if that does sort of happen?
Maybe it's another case of we need to meet people where they are. So maybe this isn't just for educators, but it's for researchers and scientists too. Maybe after you write that peer-reviewed article, maybe you should record yourself talking to somebody about it. Maybe make it more accessible to the population by providing it in multiple ways.
Right.
We've seen how popular those TED Talks are. I think that's a good indicator.
Well, podcasts too. Like I'm plugged into so many conversations I would not otherwise be, because I'm getting snippets on Twitter, or I'm going to this podcast to listen to someone I would never heard of talk about a topic of black holes for 4 hours, right?
Yeah, I think when we focus on reading and writing too much, we are we're leaving out a lot of people who want to be part of these conversations and who want to learn like this and who can retain information and they can think critically. It's just that's not the way that they can do it best. So it goes back to choice, I guess, and the whole idea of universal design. But the more choices we provide, the more avenues for not only taking in information, but also the output, showing that you've met learning objectives, the better off we're all going to be.
That's a really good takeaway, because if we're offering these things, right, and then we can help the person who really needs to do the reading for whatever reason that's best for them. That's the thing we recommend in our week 1 feedback. Hey, it looks like you didn't read the chapters. Do you need help with the chapters? I think it would be useful. Thank you for watching the video. You missed some details. Like it could be recommended to students, and that personalized learning journey could be personalized. And we have those tools here in 2024 to do that kind of thing more than ever. I'm persuaded. What other questions do we have here?
What about more kind of bite-sized reading? So I think one thing that we struggle with from a student support standpoint and also in the classroom is we have trouble getting students to follow the directions, like read the directions carefully, go through each step and do it. How does that kind of apply to this, or is that actually something totally different?
I think it does apply, and I would think it goes beyond students. I think we have that issue with trying to train faculty on things sometimes too. Everyone's time is limited, and everyone is at this point used to digesting information in really small chunks. So it goes back to meeting them where they are, right? I think one thing I'm trying to do in my classes is find YouTube shorts or record 1-minute videos where I explain a topic or introduce something, and then maybe provide a link to a reading and a link to a longer YouTube video that goes more into the topic. But there needs to be this whole menu, not just of ways to get the information, but also lengths of time and, and then ways to engage with it. I think we just have to provide it in as many places and as many options as possible.
I've heard instructors say interesting things about following the directions. I actually heard a pretty good argument for why one instructor had like very specific requirements about like when things needed to be posted to the discussion board by a certain date, and a lot of nuance in like managing all these rules. And I was like, I think this is distraction. She's like, no, part of the job is doing stuff like this. It was in a healthcare field. So this is sort of like an informal way I'm kind of assessing their ability. So some of that can be useful. I often think it's a mismatch between, I kind of put it on the instructor a lot of the time. Like if something's important to the instructor, but it's not evident why it's important to the student, I think the instructor's made an error in terms of communication or follow-up or just the instructions themselves were inadequate, I would say. It might totally be a mismatch of the student is just trying to get these 3 credits and is trying to rush through. That's possible, but we still have to meet that student. I think that instructor has to know that student. I think getting to know our students is something that it's easier than ever to not do, particularly online. And that's where we fail a lot of the time. That's where a lot of the mismatch happens, is we're treating it as this distinct thing. We're thinking of them as numbers, not as people. And then all of a sudden we can get, frustrated that they're not following our instructions, instead of saying, what can I do to make sure that they all follow my instructions for next time? Make my own life easier. Students will achieve better.
That's a good point. So it makes me think about courses that are for like pre-law students, where those students are going to go to law school. They are going to have to do a ton of reading. They're going to have to think about it critically. And so, maybe it's the college instructor's job to teach them how to do that now. Sure. Maybe it used to be the high school teacher's job, and now it's the college instructor's job to do that.
That was a concern put in the article, and I would say like that might sort of just be the new reality, and that might be okay. Like might be a very specific outcome based on a specific set of criteria about why that school does it that way, And the school might not prepare a lot of writing intensive people going to a research one, institution. If so, we have to be prepared in that 101 course to do this stuff and show it to them. That shouldn't be a big deal. The fact that we thought we didn't have to before is not an excuse for not doing it now. We might have been wrong 20 years ago, not teaching some of this stuff or just breezing through it or whatever. We probably should have been emphasizing some of this even earlier, but we have an opportunity to do it tomorrow,
Yeah.
So should we put a bow on this and talk some just effective practices, especially, looking at online courses? How can we engage the students better in learning aside from reading?
Yeah. So I'll give an anecdote. This is not from a course, but from an orientation that what we built for a welding program. And so the students were not reading the content. They were not going through it, and they were not remembering the information that they really needed to be able to start the program. And then we changed the way that we were doing the orientation. We put in very small pieces of reading and then found a bunch of videos, really short videos from actual welders talking about what kinds of skills and habits and behaviors were important for welders to be successful out in the shop. And the students, by a huge number now, are actually reading and watching the orientation and getting the information. They're completing it successfully where they weren't before. So I think less reading was part of it, but also just making it more applicable to them, having them see people, representation, right? See people from the field, people who they felt like represented the kind of person they were going to be out in the industry, talking about what was important rather than an academic trying to tell them what they had to do. Made a big difference.
A couple ideas come to mind. I think about the ways in which community colleges in particular, and I've worked for a couple, sometimes have cultures of keep your own stuff to yourself. No one helped you. Don't help anyone else. I think we talked a lot more about what we're doing, what's working, and what's not with each other. The best ideas would kind of percolate, and if we shared, I think we'd have better classes. We'd be more confident instructors. We also have to ask students what they want. Like we'll kind of do it formally at the very end, but we really need to see what students are asking for and if we're meeting it. I know that every time we sort of periodically survey students, we're always a little bit surprised by some of those results. And so if you're an instructor who's constantly trying to tweak, but only thinking about your perspective, you might be missing an opportunity to make more meaningful improvements, maybe even more lasting improvements to your courses. I think we really have to change the way we assess. My evaluations of my own courses went up significantly, like 20 or 25%. And it's stuck too when I started asking students to record the responses. When I stopped saying you need to write your responses and invited them to record, and then I actually required, interestingly, I still have some students that will write with permission, but students like the courses a lot better. There was this human connection piece. I think that's kind of the magic ingredient. My feedback simultaneously became video based, and I think they got a more classic education. Their experience was more in alignment probably with what they were expecting. In terms of like a college course, because they got to see and hear me, and there were lectures and things like that. So when I went from the multiple choice / writing class to the human class where we conversed, students liked it a lot better. And they were more integrous too. I had to worry about a lot less of AI output because they were staring at a camera, sharing what they knew or didn't know. It was real obvious and better than writing in that capacity.
Yeah, you're asking them to do a lot more active learning in that situation rather than just reading things and then spitting them out in an assignment or a test or whatever.
Right.
To add to that, one thing I'm trying to do is when I am assigning reading, I'm trying to make it more interactive. So I might post something using a platform online where I can have students read a thing or watch a video and then write a comment right next to it. So it's like you're not just reading this thing and then moving on to the next thing to take in, but you're stopping, reading this chunk of information and then thinking about it, asking a question, getting clarification if you need it, or just adding a discussion point and then moving on to the next thing. So it's chunking the information better so they don't try to just finish it all in one sitting and not stop and give their brains time to process, but it's also making it more interactive and more collaborative.
There's a big gap between chapter 2 and the unit 1 exam that's 3 weeks away. And if you can ignore chapter 2 for a number of weeks, it gets harder. You're more likely to procrastinate. You don't see the direct reason why you should read chapter 2. Right. It's a mystery if chapter 2 is going to be relevant or not. And what you're saying is by building informative practice or something, like some required reply or something, they have to apply right away, right after they've read it. Yep.
Yeah. They have to stop and think about what they're reading, even if it's a pretty basic question, or it's just to ask them to reflect on what they just read and jot down a takeaway or two. You're making them, you're kind of forcing that active learning process.
Interesting.
All right. Well, that was a great discussion. Fantastic. I appreciate your time. So next week, we're actually going to be back with another episode. We're specifically going to look at quality course design here at NICC, where we have 8 different course design standards. So we're actually going to start with looking at standard number 1, which is about navigation and course components. If you are curious what our course design standards are, I'll put a link in the description to our quality course design website for you to check out. So that's all for now. Like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.
Read the article. Bye.